Hello and welcome to Tech Deals, part 2 of the Ultimate Windows XP Retro Build video series, Benchmark Time. I have 26 different benchmarks to show you. Most of these are going to be on the i7-980X 6-core 12-thread processor overclocked to 4.5 gigahertz. However, I have a few that I also tested at stock speeds, which is 3.5 gigahertz, to give you a speed difference between 3.5 and 4.5. I also did a couple on the original CPU that was in my original iBuyPower from 10 years ago, the i7-920, which was a 4-core 8-thread chip, although I was running it at 4.5 gigahertz with the 120 millimeter liquid cooler. So both CPUs required 1.4 volts. Actually, the i7-920 required 1.4175 volts, just a slight hair over 1.4 to be stable, but the 980X was at 1.4. Now, as far as test configuration today, well, it's very custom, let's just say. I am using a ridiculous video card for this test. I fully acknowledge that the video card is out of place here, but the reason why we're using an RTX 2080 Ti is so that I can compare this 6-core 12-thread chip to modern 6-core 12-thread chips. I would like to hear from you in the comment section below. Do you want to see this i7 compared to an i7 8700K? Or a Ryzen 5 3600X. And before you all say both, that takes time. And so you can have twice as many benchmarks on one or half as many benchmarks on two. Take your pick. I guess that becomes 3 options you can pick from in the comment section below. But benchmarks take a lot of time to run, so it'll all come down to how many different tests we want to compare it to. But at 4.5 gigahertz at 6 cores and 12 threads, it's 10 years old. But that sounds kind of modern and current, doesn't it? We have 12 gigabytes of DDR3 1600 megahertz RAM. Because it's triple channel memory and there's 6 DIMMs in there, it's why it's an odd number. It's not 8, it's not 16. It's sort of a weird memory configuration due to how the X58 platforms went. Ideally, it'd be 16 to compare, but 16 is hard to do without getting new memory, and I don't want to get new memory, so we're using what I already have. SSD doesn't matter other than the fact that it's a nice brand new 1 terabyte SSD, as I showed you in part 1 of this video, which, by the way, is linked to the video description below. If you missed it, I went into extensive discussions on why this is an Ultimate Windows XP retro build, about the era of the CPU and why I did it and what came out of here and the history of it. There was a lot more talking in that video, and that video is quite long because the second half of that video, the camera is overhead and I actually show the upgrade process where we take the old parts, the original Asus P16 motherboard out of here, put it in here, we install a new 120 millimeter liquid cooler, nice one. It's got push-pull fans on it. It's a big premium model as opposed to the very cheap basic light. It's not one of the $59 models. It's a nice one. And then we put in modern storage and a few other things, but otherwise we use this nice Gigabyte C200 glass case with the pretty glass in the front, the pretty glass on the side, and all things considered, it's pretty reasonably priced for what it is, especially with all the fan mounts, which if you watch the original video, you can see those linked down below. Now, normally this is the part of the video where I say, please check the links in my video description for everything shown in today's video. Well, okay, fine. I'll link the X5675 chips, and I'll link an i7-980X to eBay down there if you are remotely interested. But as I said in the original video, if you are legitimately interested in a Windows XP retro build, if you want something to run real games from that era on the real hardware with the real operating system, this is nuts. This is completely unnecessary for Windows XP. I know that. There is nothing in 2019, as I'm recording this, that won't run on Windows 10 that needs XP and also remotely cares that you have 6 cores. There's nothing. Because anything that would even remotely use 6 cores will also run on modern operating systems. A Core 2 Duo, frankly, an E6600 first generation 2.4 gigahertz Core 2 Duo from 2006 is really all a retro XP box needs. And those can be picked up for, I don't want to say free, but close enough to free that it doesn't matter. A basic motherboard with 8 gigabytes of RAM, even 4 gigabytes. Well, actually, Windows XP. Excuse me. A basic LGA 775 motherboard with an E6600 and 4 gigabytes of RAM, because Windows XP doesn't support 8. I'm so used to saying 8. $20, maybe? I mean, you can build a retro XP machine for nothing. Don't wait 10 or 20 years to do it, because if you try to go back and build retro machines now from the early 90s, they're getting pricey. Go look up the price of a 386 or 46 motherboard that you would actually want to build an old DOS gaming computer on, or a first generation Pentium, like a Pentium 166 or a Pentium 233 MMX, and see what those are going for. They're getting pricey because good ones are now getting rare, and the retro movement is going through the 90s at the moment, and so all that stuff is starting to get expensive. Once your mind blown, go look up the price of old 3DFX Voodoo cards, a Voodoo 2 or a Voodoo 5, which was the best they ever made, the Voodoo 5 4,500 or 5,000, I don't remember. But the last Voodoo model, not the Voodoo 3, but the last one they made was really, it's going for a lot of money at the moment. But today you can build a Windows XP machine for nothing because you don't need to use hardware like this as much fun as it is. So, I mean, links down below are kind of trivial because it's the variety of gear that you can use to build such a machine. In fact, it doesn't have to be Intel. You don't have to do a Core 2 Duo. You could do an Athlon X64, an X2 64, or an Athlon 64 X4 back from that era. Those would be fine as well. Because keep in mind that for Windows XP, the games that you're running, they're not going to be from 2007, 2008, and 2009. Those will all run on Windows 7 and beyond. What you're really running is the first 3 years, games from 2001, 2002, and 2003, pre-Service Pack 2, none of which were ever designed for more than one core, which is why 2-core chip is all you need. But I have this, and now I have this, and it's fun, so why the heck not? Now, I said I have 26 benchmarks for you today. They're on Windows 10. I don't know if I'm going to do a Windows XP actual video putting Windows XP on this or not. I mean, of course it will install. This machine originally came with Windows XP on it because I got it before Windows 7 came out, and Windows Vista was Windows Vista. And so at the time, you could buy them. You could still get the downgrade. If you bought Pro, then they gave you the downgrade. I mean, sort of run Windows XP. I'm not worried about that. Let me know in the comments below if you would like to see a third video in this series with me installing Windows XP on this. And if so, what do you actually want to see? What could I show you that would be interesting? Because it will do anything. There's no benchmarks to run. There's no testing to do because it's so overkill for Windows XP. It's got 12 gigs of RAM, which is silly. Windows XP only supports 4. And that's kind of why I wasn't planning to make a third video. So I'll publish part 1 and part 2 of this series before making a third. If I do make a third, it'll be after these go live, after I've had a chance to read the comments below and see what you guys have to say. This was to some extent done because I wanted to, which, not every video I do on the channel is necessarily what I want to do. It's what needs to be done. The latest video card, the latest CPU, whatever the latest and greatest new thing that comes out. So this gives me a chance to have a little bit of fun. And I hope you guys have enjoyed the journey with me and found this interesting, fun, informative, useful, amusing. Maybe you want to build your own retro machine someday. I certainly understand. In any case, I've talked long enough. Let's get to the benchmarks, shall we? First up, we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Sit back, relax, grab a cup of coffee, because as I said, I have a lot of benchmarks to show you. Now, all of these benchmarks are at 1440p high detail, which is a compromise choice. I understand 1080p focuses more on the CPU, but who uses an RTX 2080 Ti at 1080p? So I picked 1440p for a more realistic representation of what this graphics card and CPU combination can do. Now, in this particular game, we're getting very effective use of our 6 cores. Notice the CPU usage is third line, first number, we're over 50%. In fact, we'll pass 60% several times there. We just touched 65%. And of course, these are built-in benchmarks and live gameplay is of course going to vary. The idea here is to give you a representative example of what to expect, not to have an absolute guaranteed number. This is exactly what you'll get all of the time in the game. It gives you a ballpark to give you an idea of whether it's playable and whether it's not. And it is. It's not perfect, but it's 61 frames per second average. It's certainly very playable at 1440p high detail. 36 frames per second, 1% low. It's not going to be perfectly smooth. There's going to be some stutters and there's going to be some hesitation, and that's because of the older CPU architecture, slower RAM, etc. Moving on to Dawn of War 3, you'll notice that we have a higher frame rate. In fact, at the moment, we're getting a real-time performance of over 100 frames per second. It is not, however, the smoothest 100 frames per second. Take a look at the frame rate graph there. There's a lot of little dips in there. If you're just watching this video, you might be like, oh, it's perfect. There's no issue whatsoever because you're watching a video. You're not actually seeing it in person, and YouTube provides an absolutely perfect 60 frames per second. But yeah, it definitely has a bunch of spikes in there as reflected in the 1% and 0.1% low number. 90 frames per second average is very impressive. The 54 1% low and the 31.1% low are less so. Completely playable, not a problem, but what you're basically suffering with is the same thing as Assassin's Creed Odyssey. More frame rate stuttering, worse frame pacing effectively, and when there's a lot of action going on the screen, you're going to see some dips and some stutters that you wouldn't get with a newer CPU. Next up, we have Mankind Divided. Not the newest game in the world, but hey, it's not the newest CPU in the world, so it should go just fine, right? Well, yes and no. We are using a decent percentage of the CPU, however, we are totally and 100% CPU bound here. What, you say? How's that possible? We're only using 39% of the CPU right now. Well, 42%. Oh, there's 70%. Now it dropped down to 54%. We are CPU bound because the graphics card is only using about 50% of its performance. This game is not going to use 12 threads, and it certainly isn't using all of the hyper-threading, so it's never going to be 100% usage. What cores and threads it will use, it is certainly using. And what you're seeing here is a demonstration of CPU-bound performance, where the graphics card is kind of like, well, I'll just wait for you to deliver me data to give me some frames. Having said that, 77 frames per second is pretty darn good. Even 58 in the 1% low is just fine. So what we have here is a situation where the graphics card is bored, but it still actually plays pretty well. It's just not as high as it could be. With a faster CPU, these numbers would be, of course, much, much higher. It's just that an RTX 2060 would have basically giving you the same performance as a 2080 Ti because of the CPU limitation. Changing directions, we have F1 2018, the very popular racing game from a long line of F1 series of games. In fact, F1 2019 is out, but I have 2018, so that's what we're testing. Not a huge difference between them. It gives you a rough idea. 150 plus frames per second here. That's not bad. So clearly we have no bottlenecks whatsoever going on. The performance is perfect, except we have tremendous bottlenecking going on. Now, it's a slightly different variation to the last one, but take a look at the graphics card. We're only at about 65 to 70% usage. It's not as bad of a CPU bottleneck as Mankind Divided was, but it certainly is still a CPU bottleneck. And of course, if you're using an older CPU, this is just a reflection of the fact that no matter how high you overclock it, no matter how nice it is, as we get nicer and nicer graphics cards, frankly, it's just kind of a waste of money to put fancy graphics cards on these things because of the CPU bottleneck. And of course, keep in mind, this is one of the best old CPUs you can get. It's a 4.5 gigahertz, 6-core, 12-thread, amazing processor. If you have something less than this, then obviously the bottleneck will be worse. 170 frames per second average, 112 1% low, and 35.1% low. It's great, it's playable, it's fine, it's just not all that it could be. Moving right along to Far Cry New Dawn, the full-price DLC to Far Cry 5, which I am of course contractually obligated to say every time I show this benchmark. Yes, I know it was really $30, not $60, but go with the joke, would you please? In any case, we have the same problem here as before. In fact, it's almost a copy of Mankind Divided. Our graphics card is sitting around going, are you gonna give me any frames to render? I'm bored, because we're at about 50% usage, give or take. Again, we are completely and totally CPU bound. 4.5 gigahertz on this old CPU just doesn't cut it at 1440p high detail on an RTX 2080 Ti. A 2060, maybe a 2060 Super would be just fine, but anything more than that certainly would be wasted. Now, if you have a lower-end graphics card, of course, you're not going to be bottlenecked like this. If you have an RX 580 or a GTX 1060, then you're certainly not going to be slammed this hard. But going forward, if you still have an old CPU, there really is a hard limit to what it's going to do with a new graphics card. 83 frames per second average, however, is still very, very good. It's just kind of wasting the card. But yes, it's still very playable. And this is kind of the tale of two tales, because on one hand, it's CPU bound, but on the other hand, 83 frames per second with a 59 1% low is extremely playable, so it's not a problem so long as you're okay with those numbers and maybe have a mid-range graphics card. Final Fantasy 15. I have not shown this benchmark in a while. It's been months since I've shown it, but I decided to include it to provide some variety and something different, because if I just show Ubisoft games, well, frankly, it gets kind of boring. Now, you'll notice a jump cut there. There's a couple of jump cuts because this benchmark is long, and I don't want this video to be any longer than it has to be, so I'm just going to show you pieces of it, especially the beautiful scenery here of this car drive. Take a look at how beautiful that is. The trees, the grass, that's really nice. Now we're jumping ahead to this. We actually skipped a fairly large chunk there because, again, length. I want to show you this battle with all these blasts and the sword play and the combat and all the characters. This is probably more reflective of what you're going to be looking at, and so I wanted to provide you with something that you might actually get to see in gameplay as opposed to the car driving around, which is cool, but who cares? I mean, the performance was fine. Notice that as more comes on the screen, the frame rate has dropped several times, but it's still holding comfortably in the 100 frame per second range. It's dropped down to 70 or 80 frames per second several times, but it is still pretty good overall. Taking a look at our CPU usage, we are using 6 cores here, and this is a great example of how a CPU like this provides modern gaming performance even on such an old architecture. 108 frames per second average with 70 frames per second, 1% low, and 37.1% low. So it's going to have some stutters and hitches occasionally, but overall, I would give this 2 thumbs up, especially considering how old this CPU really is. For Honor, another game that I haven't tested for months. I took it out of my rotation, shortened the list of games for a while, but since we're not doing a comparison here, I can include extra games. It's one of the benefits of just showing you general overall performance as opposed to showing you like 4 different graphics cards or 4 different CPUs, which obviously takes a lot of benchmarking time. 1440p high detail, same as the rest, and we are over 200 frames per second here. Even in heavy battles, even with a lot going on, even in the expansion, you're not going to have any performance issues here whatsoever. I would, however, like to point out, we're using 6 cores, and this is not a new game, and I think that's an important point to realize, that if you have an old 4-core chip and you have the option to upgrade to 6 cores, and especially overclock to like 4 to 4.5 gigahertz, you'll gain a level of performance that you would not get with a 4-core 8-thread chip. Like if you had an i7 920 at 2.6 gigahertz, it would not be running anything close to what you're watching right here. And that is maybe the big takeaway. So if you can't upgrade your computer, yeah, this is pretty sweet. 230 frames per second average, 177 1% low, 153.1% low. In games like this, boy, it really runs really nice. Ghost Recon Wildlands, the good Ghost Recon. Well, actually, I like Ghost Recon Breakpoint, but I've already shown Breakpoint in a different video, and so I wanted to actually take a step back to the previous Ghost Recon Wildlands game, because if you have an older computer, you might be more inclined to play older games. And of course, this one was very popular, and, well, I haven't shown it for a while, so I thought I would toss it back into the rotation. We are CPU bound here, and we are using more than 6 cores. Take a look at the usage up there. We're using 8 threads. We're using 60, 67, 68% CPU usage right there. So we are actually using all 6 cores and some of the hyper-threading, and we're still CPU bound because the graphics card's only at about 70, 80%. But again, put in an RTX 2060 instead of 2080 Ti, and that problem goes away, and the performance will still be really, really nice, especially on an old machine like this. We have an average of 98 frames per second, 65 frames 1% low, and 33.1% low. I can tell you from personal experience, it is not as smooth as a modern 6-core 12-thread machine. An i7-8700K would be a nicer experience in Ghost Recon Wildlands than it would be on this old one. But this is very playable, and if you don't have the option to upgrade, then yep, you can play big open world games like this, no problem. Another game that I have not shown recently is Metro Exodus. I did a few times in 2019 and then I took it out of the rotation. I've had several people say, whatever happened to Metro Exodus? Why don't you show it anymore? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, it requires that I launch the Epic's game launcher, and it's got a funny benchmark launcher, and it can be interesting to run, let's just say. The other thing is I've gotten a bunch of feedback from users that the game's built-in benchmark does not necessarily reflect the actual performance of the game, and I try to stay away from games where that's the case. But a bunch of you have asked, and since I don't show it very often, this is an opportunity to toss it into the benchmark routine and show it to you on an older machine like this. Very similar story to what you've already seen. We are CPU bound and we are using 6 cores. So the upgrade from 4 to 6 cores does help. It doesn't necessarily make the game monstrously faster. It's not like you're going to double frame rates by going to 6 cores, but it does uplift the 1% and 0.1% lows. It smooths things out, and it just makes for a better overall gaming experience. 76 frames per second average, 41 frames 1% low, 36.1% low. Now these numbers are actually an average of 3 runs after a first dry run because of the way it does the benchmark run. So I didn't pick out the middle run, which I usually do out of 3 runs after the first one. This is actually an average of the 3, but it's playable, but 41 in my opinion is a bit low, but that's up to you. Rainbow Six Siege is also not a game that I show very often anymore for a couple of reasons. Number one, we've kind of run past computers that run this just fine. I mean, testing modern CPUs and modern graphics cards, this game runs fine. It's designed to run on a wide variety of hardware. Now, I'm keeping to the 1440p high detail, but caution. This game does an automatic render scaling when you're at high detail. Only at Ultra does it run at full render resolution. I don't change that. So this is running at 50% render resolution, which is why it's running at over 200 frames per second. So if you play this game at high detail, just keep in mind that you're not running at 100% resolution, but the point of this game is to have really high frame rates, not the prettiest graphics in the world, although they actually are still pretty good, all things considered. 222 frames per second average, 148 1% low. This thing's spectacular. Moving on to Steep, the skiing simulator. Well, it's skiing and snowboarding, as you can see here, in a variety of other winter-type sports. I've shown this game a few times before in 2019. Took it out of the rotation for a while, but like some of the other games I've shown you here, I brought it back because, hey, when I'm just showing you a demonstration of performance, it's not too hard to stick a few extra games in, which I did. Performance is just fine. As you can see, graphics card is limited by the CPU, as in most of the games, but we are using 6-core. I cannot overemphasize the whole fact of the whole 6-core upgrade. It does make a difference, and I do think that upgrade is worthwhile if you can do so inexpensively on one of these older X58 motherboards. 112 frames per second average, 78 1% low, and 61.1% low. No issues whatsoever. This video is really a tale of 2 stories, because some of these games are brutally limited by the CPU, and other games, well, okay, let's be honest, Strange Brigade is still limited by the CPU because this really is a slow CPU by modern standards, but wait a minute, Tech, Intel hasn't even improved performance in 10 years. All the i7s are basically the same, right? Yeah, if you believe that, that's because you've been watching generational upgrades one after another and not large swath upgrades going back to old CPUs with modern technology, because the new features that came out on CPUs year over year didn't make a big difference when they launched, but they certainly made a big difference several years post-launch, and you're seeing that here, because even though we're over 200 frames per second at times, we're still being CPU bottlenecked because it's still a very old design, even at 4.5 gigahertz, which of course, just like AMD's FX series of chips, just goes to show you gigahertz isn't everything. 243 frames per second, 183 1% low, 172.1% low. So the entire speech of, but see, we're still being CPU bottlenecked, kind of falls on deaf ears when you look at these performance numbers. It's true, but who cares? World of Tanks. Again, not a game that I've shown recently and I do not show very often. This is the World of Tanks Encore benchmark. However, please note, there are multiple versions of the World of Tanks Encore benchmark. If you have seen my older tests, this is not those, because they have redone the benchmark using ray tracing. Yes, this does in fact use ray tracing, and yes, it's really pretty at points, especially with the water. Take a look at of course they have it start in the water because that's where it's pretty. The shadows and the reflections are very, very well done. Now, because it's an older game with an older game engine, it has been updated, but it's still not a AAA game. It has its limitations in places, but it does look much prettier than it used to. If you've looked at some of my older World of Tanks benchmarks, some were live gameplay. Wow, isn't that pretty? I'm sure that's why that's just gorgeous. Some of them were done in live gameplay, and some of them were done with the original version of the World of Tanks Encore benchmark, which didn't use ray tracing. So you can't compare this to any of those numbers. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to look at the 283 frames per second average and the 181 1% low and go, okay, sure, fine, it's great, wonderful. So if you have an older CPU with a reasonably decent graphics card, you can run World of Tanks just fine, which is a free-to-play game, of course, they want you to. You don't need a 2080 Ti, of course. A GTX 1660 or 1660 Super would be absolutely plenty to play this game at either 1080p or 1440p high detail. Thank you all so much for watching all of those benchmarks. For those of you who didn't fast forward, 2 gold stars for all of you. It's greatly appreciated. Normally, this is where I finish my conclusions and thoughts and share everything with you. I don't have a lot to say except for a single point. I said this in part 1, but I'll repeat it here for those of you who maybe didn't watch part 1. A lot of you watching this video are bound to say, come on, man. What are you talking about Windows XP retro build? A 6-core, 12-thread, 4.5 gigahertz i7? That's an amazing Windows 7 machine or Windows 10 machine. Come on, this isn't a retro build. This is a modern build. I understand the thinking. I hear you. Having used it, and by used it, I don't mean showing you benchmarks. By used it, I mean having installed Windows, run Windows Update, installed the NVIDIA drivers, set everything up, downloaded and installed the various game programs, Steam, Origin, Uplay, etc. Having run all the benchmarks, having put my hands on the keyboard and played with it, I assure you this is no modern machine. It feels it. It's fast in places and slow in others. It deeply depends upon what you're doing. Yes, at various times, it seems fairly modern and fairly competitive. If the programs or games or applications you're running are not saturating the limited memory bandwidth in here versus, DDR4 3200 on modern machines, if the bus and the memory controller and the architecture and a few other things that are out of date on this machine compared to modern machines, if they aren't being utilized, yeah, it might actually feel quite snappy and responsive. If you're running an older game or program, it may seem just fine. Right until you run into a wall when those are issues. It's extremely hit and miss. A good example of this is running Windows Update and then trying to download a game. On a more modern machine, give me a Ryzen 5 3600X or an i7 8700K, I can have 2 or 3 different games downloading at the same time and Windows Update running or the NVIDIA drivers running, and the whole thing is snappy and responsive. Keep in mind, we have a modern 1 terabyte SSD in here, so that's not the limitation. I do have a faster than average internet connection. I do have a fiber to the home 1 gigabit up and down connection. So I'm able to download at 110 megabytes per second, which does utilize a lot of the CPU. And I understand that if you are on a slower internet connection, it won't hurt as much. And you're probably not trying to download 2 or 3 different games at the same time. I normally can though. And the fact that this becomes frankly a slow machine when you try to do it, and more modern machines don't, reflects the updates and the changes to the CPU. This is suffering from Spectrum meltdown mitigations that modern machines aren't. It's suffering from the lack of instructions. Second generation Sandy Bridge got some new instructions, but it was Haswell, 4th generation, that really got the bulk of new instructions. AVX2, FMC3, I think it was, FMC16. There's like a dozen different instructions that were added at Haswell. Some more were added at Skylake and beyond, but most of them were added at Haswell that make a big difference. And modern programs, Haswell's now 5 years old. When Haswell came out, Haswell didn't seem that much faster because software wasn't using any of it yet. But 5 years post Haswell, now it is. And it's really making these old machines slow the minute you use anything that uses any of those new instructions, which this lacks, and so it essentially has to brute force it the hard way. Or if the textures or programs or anything you're doing now wants more memory or more memory bandwidth. Because back then, programs would have been written for memory bandwidth like this in the instruction set. Now they're not. I get it. I know. It will run Windows 10 just fine. I ran Windows 10 on it. I just showed you a ton of benchmarks on Windows 10. I would never use this for Windows 10 unless I had no other options. You could, but it's not as nice of an experience as maybe a benchmark chart would indicate. That's a tough one. How to show the real-world experience of using a machine versus looking at charts. The oldest machine I would personally use today is a 4th generation Haswell. An i7 4770K or 4790K is the oldest I would use. I have an i7 2600K and it runs at 4.5 gigahertz overclocked on a liquid cooler. And it is noticeably different than the 4790K at 4.5 gigahertz. It's the instruction sets, it's the design, the memory bus. There's a variety of changes that happen in there. It does make a difference. The difference between a 4790K and a 7700K is much less. I can tell because I do this for a living, but it's not as slap you in the face with a cold, wet fish difference that 2600K to 4790K was. And this is even a step back from that. Because at least Sandy Bridge has DMI. This doesn't. This is QPI links. It's just this is a bridge machine between the old design of Core 2 and the modern Core architecture, and it's got 1 foot in each world. It was amazing for its day. It was amazing 5 years ago. It wasn't even terrible 3 years ago. But between Spectre and Meltdown, between the latest updates and software finally truly utilizing modern instruction sets, between Ryzen introducing the world to multiple cores, Windows XP. Actually, it almost has no place at all. If you want to do Windows XP, as I said before, get a Core 2 Quad or a Core 2 Duo and you're just fine. But, This video is titled The Ultimate Windows XP Build. And I think you'll agree, this is. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you love it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with a big huge red button directly below. Questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, suggestions, you know where the comment section is. Let me know if there's anything I can show you with Windows XP on this that you'd be remotely interested. I might circle back to it at some point. It might be a month. It might be 6 months. It'll have to be a time after CES when I'm not as busy because so much is going on this time of year. I just did this now because I've been itching to do it for some time. This was a fun project. But let me know in the comments below if there's anything interesting you can see on that. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see all of you in the next video.